My first night on the job started out exactly as I'd hoped, quiet, uneventful, and just a little dull. The night manager, Paul, gave me a brief tour of the place, the aisles, the break room, and, most importantly, the tech room where the surveillance cameras ran. "Pretty standard stuff," he'd said, with a shrug. "You won't see much action, but that's the whole point of a night shift, right?" I nodded, trying to keep my nerves in check. It was my first time working a graveyard shift, but I told myself it was just a quiet suburban supermarket, nothing too exciting. Plus, the extra pay for working nights was hard to pass up. Around 1 a.m., things were going smoothly. I'd completed the usual tasks, stocking shelves, cleaning up around the registers, making sure everything was ready for the morning staff. The place was dead silent except for the faint hum of the refrigeration units. That's when I first noticed it. As I passed by the tech room, I glanced at the monitor, mostly out of boredom. The cameras showed every angle of the store, aisle after empty aisle, frozen food section, produce, checkout counters, everything was as still as it should be. But just as I was about to walk away, a flicker caught my eye on one of the screens. It was aisle 6. Something had moved, just for a second, at the edge of the screen. I squinted, leaning closer to the monitor, but everything was quiet, empty. My mind jumped to logical explanations, a mouse or maybe something rolling off the shelf. I let it go, laughing at myself. "It's just your imagination, Alec," I muttered. But that didn't stop the uneasy feeling in my stomach as I walked back to my post. Another hour went by without any more strange activity, and I was starting to feel sleepy. I'd almost forgotten about the monitor when, just past 2 a.m., there was a sound, a faint rustling coming from somewhere down the aisles. My skin prickled. I held my breath and listened closely. Nothing. Brushing it off as an air vent or something equally mundane, I turned back to my work. But then, just as I was about to move on, the sound came again, this time closer, from aisle 6. My pulse quickened as I grabbed my flashlight and made my way down the darkened aisles, my footsteps echoing on the linoleum. I shone the light around the corner, half expecting to see. I didn't even know what. But aisle 6 was empty. I let out a long breath, lowering the flashlight. As I turned to leave, though, something caught my eye on the floor, a small, crumpled piece of paper, lying directly in the middle of the aisle. I bent down and picked it up, feeling a strange sense of unease. The paper was blank, except for one thing, a single word scrawled across it in faint, messy letters. "Don't." The paper haunted me for the rest of the night. Don't. Don't what? I couldn't shake the feeling that it was left for me, that someone was watching, waiting to see my reaction. But by morning, with the first light creeping into the store, the fear faded a little, replaced by tired rationalizations. Someone must have dropped it from a shopping list or something. I tossed it in the trash on my way out, convincing myself it was nothing. The next night, though, things got stranger. Paul didn't show up, which was unusual. He was always there to start the shift, going over the evening's tasks and catching up on anything missed during the day. Instead, a note was taped to the tech room door, "Handle everything as usual. I'll check in tomorrow." It was simple enough, but his absence unsettled me. As the only person in the store, I felt more alone than ever. The night wore on uneventfully until I took a quick break around midnight. I made my way to the break room, grabbed a snack, and idly checked my phone. Scrolling through messages, I heard something odd, faint but distinct. It was a slow, rhythmic clicking sound, almost like footsteps echoing in an empty space. I put down my snack, and for a second, I sat frozen, listening. It was coming from one of the aisles. I grabbed my flashlight and moved out into the store, making my way toward the sound. It was coming from aisle 6, again. My heart pounded as I turned the corner, expecting to see something. But the aisle was just as it was the night before. Empty. Silent. Then I saw it, another piece of paper, lying in the same spot as last night. I hesitated, dread creeping up my spine. I picked it up, unfolding it slowly, half afraid of what I'd find written there. It was the same messy handwriting, but this time there were 2 words. Don't look. The light in aisle 6 flickered overhead. I took a step back, trying to convince myself it was just the fluorescent bulbs acting up. I shoved the paper in my pocket and backed out of the aisle, heart pounding. I told myself I'd just finish the shift and get out as fast as I could. But as I started to head back to the front, the store phone rang. The sound sliced through the silence, making me jump. The clock read 2:03 a.m., who on earth would be calling at this hour? I reached the phone and picked it up, trying to sound calm. Hello. There was no answer, just a faint crackling sound. I strained to hear, thinking maybe it was a bad connection, but the line stayed silent except for the static. Just as I was about to hang up, I heard a voice, a whisper, soft and garbled. Don't look. The line went dead. My skin crawled as I stared at the receiver, the words echoing in my mind. I placed it back on the hook and took a deep breath, telling myself I was just tired, my mind playing tricks. But when I looked up, the monitor in the tech room was flickering, showing static on the screen for aisle 6. Against my better judgment, I went to the tech room to check. The other cameras worked fine, but the one for aisle 6 kept flickering, static breaking up the view. And in one brief, clear frame, I saw something, or someone, standing in the aisle. It was just for a split second, but it was enough to send a chill through me. I blinked, hoping I'd imagined it. But deep down, I knew that someone, or something, was out there. And it was waiting for me to look. Sleep didn't come easily the next day. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that flickering image in my mind, someone standing there in aisle 6, waiting. I tried to convince myself it was just a glitch, maybe a trick of the light, but nothing could shake the nagging feeling in my gut. When it was time for my shift, I almost called in sick, but I knew I couldn't. I had to know what was happening. The store was deathly quiet when I arrived, and Paul still hadn't shown up. The same note was taped to the tech room door, and it somehow felt even more ominous tonight. I was on my own again, and whatever was happening here, it seemed like I was the only one who was seeing it. I started my rounds, keeping a close eye on aisle 6. But hours passed, and nothing unusual happened. The cameras showed empty aisles, the fluorescent lights hummed steadily, and there were no strange noises. I began to relax, thinking maybe the previous nights had just been stress and lack of sleep messing with my head. Around 2 a.m., I was restocking some shelves near the frozen food section when I heard it, a faint sound, like someone whispering from far away. I froze, listening, straining to catch the words. They were just soft enough that I couldn't make them out, but the tone was unmistakable, a pleading, urgent whisper. It was coming from aisle 6. Heart hammering, I turned and slowly made my way toward the aisle, clutching my flashlight tightly. As I got closer, the whispering grew clearer, words becoming almost intelligible, but not quite. It was as if they were just out of reach, slipping through my mind like sand through my fingers. When I reached the aisle, the whispering stopped. I scanned the aisle with my flashlight, my breath fogging in the cool air. And then I saw it, another piece of paper, lying in the same spot as the previous nights. My hands trembled as I bent down to pick it up. The handwriting was the same as before, messy and rushed, but now there were 3 words. Don't look back. A chill ran down my spine. I turned to leave the aisle, clutching the paper in my hand. But as I started to walk away, something strange happened. The lights above me began to flicker, casting long, eerie shadows that danced across the shelves. And then, I heard it again. Footsteps. Slow, shuffling footsteps, coming from somewhere behind me. Every instinct told me to keep walking, to leave the store, to get as far away as possible. But curiosity, mixed with a horrible sense of dread, made me turn my head ever so slightly, just enough to see the end of the aisle. And there, barely visible in the flickering light, was a figure. It was tall and shadowy, its face obscured, standing just at the edge of the aisle as if waiting for me to notice it. The footsteps grew louder, echoing in the empty store, and with each step, the figure seemed to grow clearer, more defined. I didn't wait to see any more. I bolted down the aisle, heart pounding, my breath coming in short gasps. I didn't dare look back. I could feel its presence behind me, close enough that I could almost feel a cold breath on the back of my neck. I stumbled into the tech room, slamming the door shut behind me and locking it. My hands shook as I backed away from the door, glancing frantically at the monitor. The camera for aisle 6 was now completely dead, static filling the screen. And then the phone rang. The sound jolted through me, sharp and insistent. My hand hovered over the receiver, and for a long moment, I considered ignoring it. But something compelled me to answer, a twisted mix of fear and desperation. I picked it up, my voice barely more than a whisper. "Hello." Silence. Then, that same crackling, static-laced voice from the night before, but this time the words were clear. "Don't look back." The line went dead. After that night, I was ready to quit. I knew I couldn't go back there. But something in me, a mix of pride, maybe even foolish curiosity, pushed me to return. I wanted answers, even if they came with risks. That evening, I showed up early, determined to talk to Paul, or anyone who might know more about what was going on in the store. But Paul wasn't there. In fact, no one was. The front doors were unlocked, the lights were on, but the entire place was empty. I wandered through the aisles, calling out, hoping someone would answer, but my voice only echoed back to me in the eerie silence. Just as I turned to leave, I noticed a new note taped to the door of the tech room. My heart sank as I read the single word scrawled in Paul's familiar handwriting. "Run." A chill shot through me, my pulse quickening. I wanted to leave, to bolt out of the store, but something held me back, a dark, inexplicable urge to understand what was happening here. I moved slowly, my footsteps heavy, heading toward the tech room, where the monitor glowed dimly in the dark. As I stepped inside, I noticed that only one camera was working. The rest of the screens were blank, except for the feed for aisle 6. At first, I saw nothing unusual on the screen, just the empty aisle stretching into the darkness. But then, a flicker, a movement at the edge of the frame. I leaned closer, my breath fogging the screen, straining to make out what I was seeing. A figure emerged from the shadows, slowly coming into view. It was hard to see clearly, the screen was grainy and dim, but I could make out enough. The figure wore the same clothes as me, moved like me, even held something in its hand that looked disturbingly like a note. My stomach twisted in horror as I watched the figure reach the middle of the aisle, bend down, and place the note on the floor, right where I'd found the first one. It was me. Or at least something that looked like me. I stumbled back from the screen, my heart racing. Was I losing my mind? Was this some kind of sick prank? I rubbed my eyes, hoping I'd snap out of this nightmare, but when I looked back, the figure was still there, watching the camera with dark, empty eyes. Then the screen went black. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I spun on my heel and bolted out of the tech room, racing down the aisles toward the exit. But as I ran, the lights above flickered erratically, plunging the store into alternating bursts of light and darkness. Just as I reached the front doors, I stopped dead in my tracks. The doors wouldn't budge. I yanked on the handle, desperately trying to get out, but it was locked tight, as if someone, or something, had trapped me inside. Panic clawed at me, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. I fumbled for my phone, but just as I pulled it out, the store's overhead speakers crackled to life. A soft, static-laced voice filled the air, echoing through the empty aisles. "Don't look, don't look." The voice trailed off into silence, leaving me alone with the oppressive weight of the darkened store. Every instinct screamed at me to get out, to find a way to escape, but the only way out was through the aisles, and that meant passing by aisle 6. I hesitated, my heart pounding. But I knew I had no choice. I forced myself to move, one step at a time, through the darkened store, toward the back entrance. The silence was thick and oppressive, broken only by the faint hum of the fluorescent lights. As I neared aisle 6, I stopped, my pulse thundering in my ears. The aisle was empty, or so it seemed, but I could feel something there, just beyond the edge of my vision, watching me. I forced myself to keep my eyes forward, to not glance sideways, to not look. But then, in the darkness, I saw it, a faint shape in the corner of my eye, standing in the shadows at the far end of the aisle. I couldn't help it. My head turned, just a fraction, just enough to see the figure. It was closer than before, its eyes fixed on me, cold and empty, and its hand outstretched, pointing at the floor where another note lay. I swallowed, heart racing, and bent down to pick it up, unable to resist. The note felt cold and damp in my hand, as if it had been sitting there for hours. This time, the message was different. 3 words, scrawled hastily, almost unreadable. You looked back. I staggered back, eyes wide, my heart pounding with a raw, unrestrained terror. The figure took a step closer, and then another, its face remaining obscured in shadow but its presence growing heavier, darker. I didn't wait. I ran. I ran faster than I ever thought possible, weaving through the aisles, heart pounding, gasping for breath. The oppressive silence pressed down on me, broken only by the echo of my own footsteps and the distant, eerie crackle from the overhead speakers. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Every instinct told me that whatever was following would be right there, inches away, ready to close the distance the moment I slowed down. Reaching the back of the store, I threw myself against the emergency exit, but the door wouldn't budge. Locked, just like the front. My mind raced, searching for any way out, when suddenly, the lights cut out completely, plunging the store into absolute darkness. For a few seconds, I just stood there, frozen, trying to adjust my eyes to the pitch-black silence. And then, a faint glow emerged from somewhere deeper in the store. My skin prickled with dread as I realized it was coming from aisle 6. I had no choice but to head toward it. If there was a way out of this nightmare, it lay in whatever was waiting for me down that aisle. I moved slowly, my footsteps echoing through the empty store, and as I approached aisle 6, the glow grew brighter. A small flashlight lay on the floor in the same spot where I'd found the other notes. I picked it up, and as the beam cut through the dark, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A mirror. It stood right in the middle of the aisle, propped up against the shelves, reflecting the narrow stretch of space behind me. But in the dim light, the reflection was wrong. I could see myself, but something was off. My own face looked back at me, but it was pale, hollow-eyed, and twisted with an expression of fear I hadn't felt, at least, not yet. As I stared, transfixed by the reflection, I noticed a movement behind my mirrored self. Something was standing there, just out of reach, a shadow creeping closer with every second. Its hand rose, reaching for my shoulder in the reflection. Don't look back, the words echoed in my head, clearer now, louder, as if they were coming from right behind me. But I couldn't move. I was rooted in place, frozen by fear, watching the shadow draw closer, feeling its icy presence at my back. Then, the reflection shifted. My own mouth moved, but it wasn't me speaking. The words appeared on my lips, whispered in a voice that wasn't mine. You should have run. I broke free of my paralysis, stumbling back, tearing my gaze from the mirror. The flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows along the aisle as I backed away. But before I could move further, I felt it, a hand on my shoulder, cold, firm, unmistakably real. I spun around, expecting to see I don't know what. But there was no one there. Just the empty, silent aisle, stretching out into darkness. Heart pounding, I turned back to the mirror, clutching the flashlight in trembling hands. My reflection stared back at me, looking as terrified as I felt. But something was wrong. The reflection's lips moved again, forming words I couldn't hear. Then the store speakers crackled to life, and the words came, distorted, echoing through the aisles. You looked. You shouldn't have. The flashlight blinked off, plunging me into darkness. I scrambled to turn it back on, but the light stayed dead. The store was utterly silent, except for the faint, echoing sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming closer. Desperate, I backed away, feeling along the shelves, trying to find my way out. My hand brushed against something cold and metallic, and I realized I was near the tech room. Maybe, if I could reach the cameras, I'd be able to see a way out, or at least understand what was happening. I threw myself into the tech room and locked the door behind me, fumbling for the lights. The screens glowed to life, casting a dim glow across the room. I watched the feeds, breath held, scanning each aisle for any sign of movement. Aisle 6 was empty. But then, on the screen, the figure appeared, standing in the middle of the aisle, facing the camera. Slowly, it raised a hand, pointing directly at me. I felt my blood run cold. Somehow, it knew where I was. I tore my gaze from the screen, heart pounding, and reached for my phone to call for help. But when I lifted it, I realized it was already on, the screen showing an ongoing call. I pressed it to my ear, and the line crackled with static before a voice whispered, soft and chillingly familiar. Don't look. The call ended. I dropped the phone, breath coming in ragged gasps. I turned to face the door, hand gripping the knob, ready to make a final dash for freedom. But just as I unlocked it, a shadow passed under the door, and I heard a faint, familiar voice, echoing from the other side. You looked back. The handle turned on its own, the door creaking open just an inch, revealing darkness beyond. I took a step back, but I could feel the pull, as if something was reaching out from the shadows, drawing me closer. The last thing I saw before the door swung shut was the faint outline of a figure in the doorway, waiting. And as the darkness swallowed me, I heard the words again, soft, echoing, inescapable. You looked. And now, you're mine.